Hello, Cardstack community. My name is Christine. I'm the founding director of the Cardstack project, coming to you from the land of the Web3. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Illia, co-founder of Near Protocol, to talk to us about usability in Web3. I think there's something that everybody talks about the potential of Web3 and what that means and all the different jargons that go within, but it won't be anything unless this land of ours is lived in by people who are maybe transplant or extension from the Web2 world, from the mobile world, from the world that really made an impact in our digital lives. And we think that can continue with the tools and technology and protocol we're developing. And Near is a very important part of that journey. We'd love to get Illia thoughts on like what the protocol is about and what is the missing piece to make this actually usable and vibrant community that will influence everybody in this world. Welcome, Illia.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey into the space of crypto Web3 and what is of that distilled in the vision and the current process of the Near protocol?
For sure, yeah. So my background is in applied math, and actually for about 10 years been doing machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I left Google Research to start an AI startup with my co-founder, Alex. And through the journey there, we ended up building a kind of community effort to collect data for the problems we were trying to solve with AI. We were teaching machines to code. And so we had a number of people around the world working on collecting data. We had, a few partners who were working with us on building different models on this data. And so the problem we faced, though, was ability to pay to these people, right? It was people in China, It was people in Russia, in Ukraine, and we had even a couple of people from Cuba. And so we started looking at blockchain kind of as as we've seen it to be a global payment network to kind of solve this need. But we faced both, pretty high fees for microtransactions we were doing, even back then in 2018. And obviously the kind of experience of the whole process, right, both on developer side and as a user was extremely not there, coming from Web2. And so we looked across, all the blockchains and protocols that we're building. We kind of looked across what people were trying to solve, and nobody was trying to solve this kind of a holistic picture of like, how do we deliver a experience that people will build on and use without needing to think about kind of underlying kind of protocol and blockchain, right? Like, either it was, hey, as a developer, you need to know about, you're going to launch your own chain, or you're going to figure out how to do something. As a user, you need to know which chain you're using, which like application you're using, etc. Like, do you have tokens to pay gas on that chain, on this chain? Like, it's always was like a lot of stuff were pushed into kind of user and developer space to understand how to use the stuff. And so that's really how we started thinking about Near, is like, how do we deliver usability and, focus on security, focus on scalability as well, because they actually deliver this usability first, like with the values of ownership, with the values of, kind of this global access, composability, etc., that Web3 has.
Yeah. So it's interesting that when you're working on something that you think blockchain is going to be good at, you end up going back to the infrastructure because as either builders or users of the application, it becomes clear that what's missing. My journey is similar. I'm trying to build some media application. I used to work in the media industry in the more traditional kind of publishing aspects of it. And it's, blockchain is great. And then you go and it's like, okay, there's nothing. You have to go a couple of layers deep. So, as you're trying to build this like payment network for onboarding users in the previous use case, you discover a set of primitives that was missing. And when you kind of say, okay, let's go and solve some of these problems, what are the kind of like your top, maybe two things that you believe was missing, especially in the ecosystem that was maybe the dominant at the time, like in the EVM or Ethereum ecosystem? Obviously, Bitcoin has a slightly different community. But what are the missing pieces that you feel like, hey, this is something we either have to curate or invent in our ecosystem to solve it? Can you kind of tell us like your driving force within this missing piece?
Yeah, so we started with the scalability part because kind of it seemed very strange to us, right? So I came from Google. My co-founder built a sharded database called Single Store that's used by Fortune 500 companies. And so it was very strange to us, right, that everything runs on one computer. Like it's replicated, but it's still one computer limitation. And so kind of anytime, any single app kind of had success, everything else pretty much stopped, right? And also everything became extremely expensive. And so what we kind of started with is like, how do we achieve kind of ideally limitless capacity? And obviously there's a lot of, asterisks and limitations that come in, but kind of generally, how do we approach this more as, like this network needs to be able to grow in size as more usage comes in. And so that's where, our kind of focus on sharding and dynamic resharding that still kind of building toward is coming from, is like, how do we solve the scalability in such sense that like each app, it can be isolated and have its own capacity, and then the network can grow. And there's a lot of technical decisions that we made very differently to enable the user experience and developer experience to be better. Meaning we don't want developers to think about the layout of the network. We don't want users to need to think about like, hey, am I running on this shard or that shard? Like all of that is completely hidden from them.
Right.
And then the second one has been kind of this user experience land, right? Is everything from onboarding to kind of interacting with apps to managing your account to security of your account, etc. And so we've rebuilt completely the account model to be, I think the simplest way to say is like your account itself is a username. So it's not like 0x something. It's, proper like illia.near. It follows the main name kind of registration process as well. But you can have different access keys to this account, right? Some of them can be full access and you can have multiple of them. You can have also permissioned access. And so what it allows to do is a lot of different use cases, right? Everything from a game, for example, can authorize its own key, and now you can interact with the game without needing to go to wallet to sign every single transaction. But it's still permissioned and has like limited capacity. You can give someone a single-use private key, right, which allows them to claim an NFT or get some tokens, which is pretty unique. Like you cannot send money to someone who doesn't have an account in Venmo or in banking system, and here you can actually send somebody money who doesn't have any accounts yet just by clicking a link. You can have things, for example, where somebody else can recover your account, right? It can be, semi-trusted party like a bank or a group of friends. You can have 2FA. You can have kind of, multi-device confirmation. You can have limitations on how much you can spend per day on specific account and specific device. So you can have kind of a limitless kind of potentiality, but what it allows it to build better experiences for users. And so that's, I think, been one of the biggest, inventions that we did. I think the third piece is really focusing on WebAssembly and building out the tooling around it. So kind of EVM obviously was like built, in 2014 when there's actually WebAssembly wasn't there. And to be clear, the person, Gav, who built EVM right now is using WebAssembly.
Yeah.
So
he's a big proponent of that in the Polkadot ecosystem.
Exactly, yeah. And so there's a lot of limitations in EVM just because it was built in a kind of, on one side for a very specific purpose, on the other side, kind of, it wasn't, it wasn't a years and years of like evolution of people who've been doing kind of this like virtual machines, right? And WebAssembly actually is. And so that is a base. And so then there's a huge community of people who doing tooling for WebAssembly because it's, in every browser and kind of accessible to a lot of different things. And
it's built-in distribution in the Web2 space that like improves the tooling. So it's the people building tooling are just generic engineer working at Google or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And so that what it allows to do, kind of, it took us some time as well to optimize a lot. But from the start, you can actually use a lot of existing code to run on top of Near. And the really cool example is actually we took EVM, right, that machine that is inside Ethereum, and we ran it as smart contract on Near, right, as one of apps on Near, just like literally running the same code. And similarly, kind of recently, we took JavaScript and ran it like the full JavaScript VM on top as an app on Near.
Right.
And so I think that enabled kind of a pretty unique ability to build apps on Near that are way more sophisticated and complex because you can kind of take on existing pieces of code and pull them together into a new apps.
Yeah, it's amazing that you think about like the whole sharding and scalability and then the account model as well as the tooling for developers. A lot of it seems to be like, hey, there are some really, really good technology and design patterns and usability experience in the Web2 space, in the mobile space, in the cloud space. We should start from that versus trying to make Web3 its own island to make it incremental adjustments of it. Are you seeing that people looking at this, and obviously, I've done stuff in cloud before and understand a lot of concepts that you're talking about, looking at JavaScript as a distribution platform, not just like a programming language and the aspects of that creates. Do you see resonance of these kind of aspect more with kind of developer new to Web3? A lot of people learn Solidity as a first language. Let's say just talk about developer for a second. Are you seeing resonance from people who had the deep experience in cloud and another aspect like yourself and your co-founder sensing, hey, finally some tools I expect that I need to do the application? What are you seeing more of? Like a realization that there is some history in and tooling that exists in the computing system, or the recognitions that finally something is there for me to do what I need to do as an app developer migrating to Web3?
I think it's both. I mean, we definitely see like folks who either like new or even some people existing who are like, oh, finally there's tools that I've been wanting to have or I've been trying to build myself that just like come out of the box, right? Like we had some people who are like, hey, I've been trying to build, like this account model, like some of similar account model ideas in Ethereum, right? Like trying to do this account abstractions, but like on Near it just comes out of the box, right?
Right.
And like some of the meta transaction flows, etc. Like it's all already there. And so that kind of like, oh, I don't need to build into it, like you mentioned in the beginning, right? Like every time you try to build something, like, oh shit, I need to build a bunch of this structure.
Exactly.
Like here, you don't need to. You can actually just build your app, right? And so we've definitely seen a lot of folks who are like, oh, great, I can just focus on the product that I want to build. I think on the developer side, what especially JavaScript is indeed enables is people who are curious in Web3, but haven't tried yet, right? Like it can be people who've, traded some tokens. It can be people who've read, articles and news,
right.
But they haven't really, dipped their feet because they're like, oh, I need to learn Solidity. I need to learn Rust. I need to, start like figuring out all those things. And here they're like, oh, cool. I could like, it's just, npx create Near apps, the same as React app, and you have the thing running, right?
Yeah.
That's like
Muscle
a very
memory.
different amount of investment, that they need to have. And it's like yarn deploy, yarn run, boom. You have an app running. It has a front end. It has a back end. It's all, already up and there. And so what we see there is mostly like, it's just the ease of onboarding that kind of like the people who were interested and are interested, but don't have like a clear, like, oh, I want to do blah, right? They're actually trying to do this and playing with it and maybe coming up with ideas how they can use it. So I think that's kind of the really two major things. I think that the other side that I've heard many times is like, hey, we cannot hire engineers, right? Like, hey, Rust engineers are expensive, Solid engineers are expensive and rare. And so here again, like when I mentioned, hey, like we have JavaScript, they're like, oh, cool. Like I don't need to hire new engineers. We already have in a company, front end and full stack folks who can just do this. So I think that is really kind of what we see.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit of JavaScript. I think, in technology, when you look at the history, we have this cockroach technology, a technology that will never die. Like nobody expects JavaScript, a language invented in 10 days, to have such an impact in the world. And even WebAssembly, in a way, is a subset of JavaScript, right? Not strictly speaking, but kind of, right? So like inspired by this runtime everywhere else, and you can run JavaScript on top of that, on top of something else. And there was a famous talk on like the birth and death of JavaScript, right? That was the Destroyer software. Famous thing. And in this idea of this layer of technology that we can build, seems like what you guys are doing is that, hey, once you have a reasonably good runtime, you can actually run things like EVM on top of it. And we're seeing that in the ZK ecosystem within the Ethereum space. Is the developer experience in Near mostly not just around tooling? Do you write programs that runs or smart contract in JavaScript in your ecosystem?
So JavaScript has launched on August 7th. And so before that, I would say primary was Rust. But we do see kind of a pretty fast growth already, and I'm honestly sure that in like months or a couple months, the JavaScript will be the dominant one.
It's dominant, right?
Yeah. I mean, people because it's WebAssembly, you can write in almost anything. So people have done
C
like
if you want to.
people have done a few other languages. Somebody's experimenting with Python as well. like the JavaScript is actually C because it runs QuickJS VM, which is written in C. So you can do whatever you want, and people doing that, like when, some people just like to experiment and try new things. But I think for like dominant over time will become JavaScript. And I mean, the second one will continue to be in Rust just because of security.
Just because that's the best tooling, yeah.
It's the best language, honestly.
Yes, I wouldn't disagree.
No, I mean, it's just like if you want to write secure code and you want to make sure that and you want to refactor code ever in your life, Rust has been, way more efficient at that. But JavaScript will just be like way more efficient at like getting stuff out and getting it in front of people.
Yeah, especially some of the business logic of application as it gets further to consumer is not less about like precise math and this, and more like, give this person access to that. Those type of logic is actually pretty easy to express.
No, just to mention, like actually, I'm just paying out the bounty I set for somebody to marry Rust and JavaScript, so you can write the Rust smart contract that calls out into JavaScript subroutines.
Right.
And so you can have your like monetary system written in Rust, but then all the business logic on who, when, how, etc. can be written in JavaScript. And so you can put it all in one smart contract.
That makes a lot of sense. And that happens in, obviously anytime you go through like a real runtime, there's more cost on it. But as far as a way to like leverage the developer, you have to look at like this type of business logic works best in this language, and that type of like formalism work best for these type of more sensitive use case. I think it's what's supposed to be, right? JavaScript is supposed to be a scripting language for the simple behavior, not necessarily, governing the financial system. Rust is a much better language for that type of precision that we ascribe to for Solidity, really. I'm a big Rust developer, has a lot of friends who worked at Mozilla at the time of the invention of Rust and the creation of that ecosystem. Python, interesting thing that you mentioned Python. Is it something, obviously Python having a garbage collector and having something like that is harder to implement into WASM is quite expensive. In the work that you're doing, when you talk about your machine learning journey, working on that, obviously a lot of applications are very easy to express in Python, especially with all the data analytic tools and stuff like that. Is there any plan to allow for like kind of PyData, this type of data analysis use case on top of the Neo ecosystem?
So you can do this now. There's actually off-chain. So for things like if you want to analyze the on-chain data, for example, or interact with blockchain, we have APIs in Python. We have sounds of libraries in Python. And I know like a bunch of people who are playing around and like, in Jupyter Notebook, like pulling data and kind of like trying to understand what's going on chain and stuff like this. I think for on-chain stuff, analyzing data is kind of complicated. So it's more of a business logic type thing as well. Although, the teams behind Protocol are constantly optimizing everything, and so they're trying to bring the performance of the smart contracts as close to native.
Yeah.
And so like we can at some point expect that somebody will just actually do a bunch of stuff. I mean, obviously, like there's a limitation on time per transaction and stuff like this. Like so,
that's true.
Like, it's more similar to like on Amazon the Lambda style thing, right? You have like a microservice that you can call into that has a database, and so I would expect the use cases like that, but you can imagine somebody like processing images as well as part of a transaction.
Yeah, in those things like optimizing the images in that particular time or generating an NFT, similar logic within those time. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So somebody did that in JavaScript already, generating NFT as part of smart contract just by pulling a library for NFT generation inside smart contract.
Yeah, I think it's so cool because if you think about the NFT ecosystem, people think about like, the most important piece of software in the NFT ecosystem is Photoshop. Right. And people sometimes forget that. And it's like, no, actually the magic, the person behind the mirror is Photoshop. But yeah, I think when we see a lot more innovation of actually bringing the media and in kind of closing the loop. So it's not just like some external kind of like pre-assembled things that just assemble for the purpose of monetization is actually an ecosystem. One of my first applications I built in blockchain was building an NFT marketplace on the Bitcoin blockchain. In that case, you can't even control the flow of money. This is mostly just proof of existence and anchoring it. But we did tokenize different rights on chain and make different token account for like the rights to resell a different tokens. So we haven't seen that yet. I think the logic of NFT sales is relatively simple. So I think we're going to see innovation in the actual media type of NFT getting its own native forms. And that's going to require a lot more programmability to actually turn that media away from these JPEG encoding and Photoshop layerings into something that's actually constructive. It's really exciting to see. You mentioned a little bit about the account model. Let's talk a little bit about the account model. There are tools in the Ethereum ecosystem. We're part of a community called the Nodes are Safe community, where we're trying to recreate the account model and meta transaction on top of the infrastructure. In terms of the NEAR ecosystem, do you see the main adoption being through like browser wallet where you can get an account, or do you see that as mobile, or what is the account model do you think that would get the most people involved? There's a different modality, including things like WebAuthn, which some protocol in the past has tried, including EOS and the Internet Computer Project from Dfinity. What do you think is going to be the best modality to bring more users in with the account model underneath? But what is the kind of interface into the account model?
Yeah, it's been Web Wallet. I mean, partially because it's the thing we launched with, and so it was the easiest thing. Partially because you don't need to install anything, and you also don't need to go through Apple and Google to get it in front of the user. Right. So if you think of mobile apps, they need to get approved by Google and Apple. And it's been it's always a fight for those companies that are doing that to actually get listed there. At the same time, I mean, obviously mobile is huge, right? And people do find comfort in installing an app that I would not say that web pages actually always deliver. And so I would say and we have already a few apps that have launched for mobile wallets. So I would expect it's going to be a combination. And so there's interesting ways how these things actually can flow between each other. And I think, again, the point that you can actually have multiple keys with different permissions is the point here. You can actually authorize a web app, right, with your mobile wallet, and then go to web app and interact with it without going and signing every single transaction, right? It's not, if you imagine Wallet Connect, you connect once, but then, you still need to authorize every single transaction. Here, you can just, connect and authorize a specific set of things and now play your game, trade your finance, on your finance app or whatever you need to do. And kind of within that session, you have the kind of capabilities, and you can always withdraw the access on your mobile wallet, for example, or your web wallet later if you don't want this app to have these permissions. And so, I think that kind of flow is what going to enable, and I think there will be also more kind of injected wallet capabilities as well, where even wallet selectors right now that show you all these wallets. If you're new to crypto, you have no idea what those things are. Imagine, you're going to 1inch and you're I have no idea what any of these names are, right? And so, but what we have now is we have login with Google, we have login with email, which are delivered by different providers, right? It's Taurus, it's Magic Link, etc. And so again, you can start with those, and you can then switch to something else, because on NEAR the accounts are. You can always rotate the keys. You can remove one method and add another method, etc. So you can always have this ability to kind of log in, get started, and then switch. And so I think that the experience of that, making that kind of a singular experience as a whole ecosystem, is what's important. And so that's kind of what a lot of folks on our side, kind of across the ecosystem, are trying to pull together. Is what is this flow that users can go through that actually informs, in a way, removes the barrier to entry, but then inform them that they should, maybe if you have millions of dollars, maybe you should get a hardware device, right? Get this thought in front of the user, right? Maybe they just don't know.
Yeah. Similarly, maybe have some wallet that it's almost you can't do more until you get a hardware wallet. It's almost like like a safeguard, like a child safety seat built into the protocol.
Similarly, if a malicious app is getting you to sign a transaction that is stealing all your money, probably it should not go through, right? Hey, you're trying to interact with a malicious smart contract. We can actually surface all that to the user, and so that's a set of standards we're trying to put together in our ecosystem, so that wallets and the wallet selectors and all those pieces of the ecosystem can actually really surface and make it more usable for the user and secure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sometimes we look at the Google and Apple, or even the larger organization like Coinbase and something like that, as like, people who know how to manage their own keys. And some people are making this kind of binary choice, like, oh, you can either control your own key or just let people do it themselves. But there is a world I can see that, like, if you log into, like, your recovery network is log into Coinbase, they have a key shard, and they've logged into Apple, they have another key shard. If you have enough login, then maybe you can recover. It is a good way of, instead of just relying on your friends, because the joke in crypto is that the hardest thing about social recovery is that you need 3 friends. And most people in crypto have no friends they can trust. That would be it. It's interesting that there's a huge design space about how to use professional DevOps engineer that works for these big company as part of your security stack and still achieve self-sovereignty. But that building block, I think, is there. It's just there's more work to split up the work to be done there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's also an interesting point that people in crypto forget, but those entities actually like entities, and you can sue them if they do something like that you didn't ask them, right? And so that's why they're actually more secure than your friends who, like, you can, in this sense.
Well, yeah, I agree. It's harder to sue your friend. Like, for what? For his gaming rig? Maybe you want that. It's interesting to look at that.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, like they can accidentally, lose or get hacked themselves, right? So, but anyway, but I mean, I think like this is all options that people should have, but they should be easily available, right? You should be like, hey, I want this option, like friends, and I'll add their accounts, and boom, it's enabled, right? Or I want, the like a bank or set of banks, or or Fortune 500 companies, and I'll just log into all of them, and it enables it.
Yeah,
and I mean, like, yeah, we have all the pieces kind of in, like, cryptography is there, this is there, Arakan models there. Now we just need to pull together it into products that actually are for our users.
So you mentioned that there's a lot of the kind of gaming use cases doesn't really make sense to go to formalism of approving every single transaction that currently exists in the more wallet connect ecosystem. Obviously, that maps very nicely to the kind of the emerging use cases for decentralized social, decentralized gaming, or GameFi. What kind of project you're seeing that people are kind of like choosing near to build because of those capability, and what are the kind of the next group of use cases beyond DeFi that you're seeing that's specifically excites you, that like, that's a perfect use of the capability we have in there, and I'm glad developers are pushing that boundary on what this platform can do.
Yeah, I mean, games kind of mentioned because we've seen a bunch who have done this in this way, and it's been a pretty powerful kind of changing experience. I think the social is definitely the other one that's still up and coming. There's still kind of no good examples where, like, okay, well, this is why we do social on Web3. Like, I mean, DAOs is maybe kind of it's like an embryo of that idea. But it's still like, but there's a lot of folks in the ecosystem are pushing this direction very, very kind of actively, and I'm really excited about that. And so I think where the interesting becomes is where these things kind of connect, right? When you have this idea that you can take your account, right, and you maybe like use, for example, Uminter, where you start minting NFTs as part of your build a community around this. Uminter is like an Instagram, but every post is an NFT. But then you turn your account into a DAO. Like, you can actually literally flip your account, make it a DAO, like get your community to participate, to make decisions. Like, if you have an NFT, you make decisions. Maybe you issue a token out of it, etc. And then you issue a token, you put it into a lending protocol, right? That then kind of, you could borrow with that and kind of pay some people to do more stuff, right? So you can have like a kind of a full flow of this, where you start paying people to build a game around the NFTs you're using and stuff like this. So that, like, I think the composability of this is really where I'm excited about, because like the more links we see between these things, the more kind of powerful this whole system becomes.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that we are in Web3 we have this composability in the back end in the traditional sense, where the services and contracts can actually compose. But in the front end, we're still very much like, oh, I'm going to build a front end that looks like Instagram. I'm going to make a front end that looks like a exchange or trading interface. I'm going to make a website that looks like a gallery or e-commerce experience. and there's still friction for user to navigate. Despite the thing and it being the same, there is still kind of this real limitation of the genre of the UX that defines them to be seemingly different things. That's definitely something that we've been, at Cardstack working on, is like, can we shrink these full-size app into cards, smaller units, and allow them to compose, so you can actually compose the underlying protocol, which is the same cost, right, to the contracts and stuff like that, but using the JavaScript as a way to modularize this stuff. And it's, there's a lot of, programming issues about, our cards NPM modules, which we have, say, the ES modules, so we can go and make and use the Web Center happen. But the hardest thing is design system. Getting people to acknowledge that, your swap card needs to fit within a larger thing, because you may need to do a swap in between doing two actions. Like, say, getting the token necessary to a mint, but the mint can only be doing this token. Why do you need someone to bounce between 5 URLs and log in 6 times, or in the EVM ecosystem approve 227 transactions to just do that? They just don't do it, right? Is there a way to kind of synthesize it? And obviously the ability to, issue one permission to adapt and allow that to kind of automate these action in a Zapier kind of way, which is what the Web2 people use to connect things without having to log in, authorize every single time, is where that kind of composability. So I think UI composability, which is what we are doing to our heart, is really reliant on the underlying account composability, scalability of the thing, and also the developer kind of solving some of these lower level primitives. But yeah, I agree. Composability is the value. And I don't think we have delivered it yet. I think we've delivered the silos that shows that it can, but bringing it together would be the most exciting thing.
Well, I think DeFi kind of been interestingly like showcasing that. I think people don't give it as much credit as they should, because I think the Uniswap being like a core thing that everybody else built on, right, and then lending, and then everybody builds on top of it. So like I think that being a very powerful piece. I think beyond that, it's been kind of hard to show, and yeah, sometimes like I remember. Kind of, there was like, hey, you can, lever up this way and this way, like using 3 different apps. And it was like, yeah, UI part was like extremely complicated. Or right, until somebody built like a one button thing that says like, just do that.
Yeah. Automation script, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But like overall, like, yeah, how, like if you want something else, then you need to do it again manually. So I think there's definitely still, like, how do we do UI? I actually think this is where JavaScript becomes interesting again, because you can execute any JavaScript on chain and near, what you can do, you can actually send JavaScript as part of your transaction. So you can write the code, which may contain a for loop, right, or whatever, that then gets executed on chain, calling other contracts. And so you can kind of write, like, execute programs, which means it's really easy to share recipes, etc. And so you can have your front end cards, for example, to compose, and then they in turn compose a program that will execute on chain.
Yeah, exactly. With the multi-core interface that we have in the kind of interface, it's still somewhat sequential. It doesn't have that logical loop that allows you to say, okay, if I get the mint on this level, then do that. If not, do something else. And you can't kind of get your own personal strategy. People use that in Web 2 with different type of automation script with Zaps, right? Which is the Zapier underlying thing. Not open source, totally permissioned. You get grant permission to your Dropbox and your Google Drive and 6 of your government website just to be able to do the automation. Pretty insane. Absolutely no limitation possible. Pretty dangerous, I think, but it's what people use. It's really interesting to us to think about these action sequences with internal logic that is working just for that user, right? It's not like a protocol that everybody shares. It's your own proprietary advantage or your own script that if you can no-code construct that tool, and then be able to like essentially compile it to some sort of deliverable. And it's interesting. And I'll keep in my mental space. It's like, yeah, there's a JavaScript kind of for loop runtime in near, but we're definitely thinking about like drag and drop tools and like Zapier type of experience for people to construct things that like, okay, if I sell this thing, if they do that, then do this. And the logic could be as simple as an OpenSea type of thing where this is a marketplace, but it could be more complex in helping people orchestrate across those things, because these APIs and these protocols as they deploy are pretty much just places you have to go to, and to kind of like put your itinerary together is still something that like DeFi trader or degens. I think we forget that a lot of degens, if you actually watch them work, it's kind of just laboring, going from one button to another button. So it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of. That's why it's called farming, is because it's laborious.
It's laborious, and I mean, when they're done with their day, they are up 20% or something, right? Like that's pretty good.
On a good day, yes.
On a good day, on a good day. So not financial advice. I'm just observing some of the best player doing some of the best work on the best day. So your mileage may vary, but it's actually surprisingly not quite low tech. I think people would think of every interaction as some high tech interaction, but it's incredibly manual to do all this yield
it's
farming.
Stitching together a bunch of stuff. So this is actually somebody was suggesting. So because near accounts are also contracts, and so what you can do, you can actually deploy a contract on your account, which becomes your trading machine, and so and you can then program it to do whatever, right? And so somebody was building that because, like, in a way, you can just program your account to do stuff on your behalf. And then there's things like croncat, which is like decentralized cron, that can call this thing to kind of execute based on what's happening in the environment. And so in a way, you can actually just like program a strategy or some set of strategies or some even searchers potentially that can search through the space. The problem being this will be all open source. So as soon as you do that, everybody else will kind of follow, right? But that's a problem for another day of like adding more privacy. And we actually really want to invest in that over time and build up more and more like ZK capability on that. But I think that's an interesting paradigm of like your account becomes your kind of personalized trader machine that then, or like not just trading, right? You can do a lot of other things, but like your kind of agent on chain that, you kind of give commands and then it executes even when you're not, in front of a computer.
Yeah, it's interesting that even these kind of logic needs to be waken up. Do you have an infrastructure within your ecosystem that would like run periodic tasks? We're working on a scheduled payment tool.
Yeah.
Is that something that's decentralized, or you have to run your own node that like keeps alive?
It's decentralized. Yeah. How does that work? You pretty much tell it what to do, and then there's a network of like croncats who agents pretty much who then like execute these things.
Yeah, like we had to run our own, we call it Crank. That's our internal code name for it, just because in our ecosystem, that doesn't really exist in a cost-effective way and generic enough way. So we have to like, for our scheduled payment product that we're launching soon for Ethereum, do the recurring payment. We gotta, every minute wake up and see whose payment is due. Now the benefit of that is that because all the payments are pre-signed, you don't know when your scheduled payment is coming out. We have our own server, and it's kind of achieving some of the balance of like not knowing that you're going to do a payment and still be able to decentralize when the payment gets submitted on chain. So that's kind of service we're working on top of the Nodes are Safe ecosystem. But it's so much easier to not have to build that. So I kind of going back to our original point. If I knew a bit earlier, I would have done it near and like just use croncat instead of building our own crank system. But that, that's a good thing. Like, I think this parallel experimentation from builders is really helping us figure out what the primitive is going to be that we need to grow together in the Web3 thing. This is super exciting. Are there something that, from the near roadmap that would be most relevant given what we discussed that you would like to kind of tell us a little bit about maybe in the Q3, Q4 timeframe?
Yeah, so there's a kind of one of the companies in the ecosystem called Pagoda, which is leading a lot of this work in the ecosystem to support JavaScript. And they are planning to launch a number of more tooling to kind of enable the full project lifecycle for your kind of smart contracts. Like what they already have is analytics and triggers alarms. So if you can actually set up notification if more than like 10% of all the value is being moved out of your contract, which I think like over time will evolve into some security features and insurance products as well, where you're making sure that like you limit how much is leaving per day or per 24 hours to make sure that if something hacked, then you limit the scope, which then in turn you can be actually insuring this thing, right? Because now you're like, oh, you can only lose in 24 hours this much. We can actually insure you by this much, and then we monitor and pause the contract or whatever, like fix the contract if something happens. So anyway, Pagoda is building a lot of this, and kind of they're probably going to be they're going to be launching a lot more tooling around JavaScript and kind of templates, etc., that people can use. And then I think the other side, which is really interesting, is Calimero. So Calimero is a private shard technology which allows you to run kind of all of the near stuff, but inside your firewall, inside your kind of a company or even DAO, right? The benefit is because near is already kind of asynchronous message passing protocol underneath, you can actually communicate between private and public shards exactly the same way. So your contract can actually interact with private shard, other contracts to pull data. Your private shards can interact with each other. And obviously JavaScript now is available, and you can write in Solidity as well through Aurora. And so you have this kind of ability now to build kind of privacy-focused use cases or private use cases for specific things, but still using public assets. You may be minting NFTs privately and then moving them out into the public later. So like all of the stuff is kind of available and coming out in next kind of incoming months.
So exciting. And I think that the idea of doing that private strategy could be a way to do that, right? Use the private shard to run your
so you can
logic,
actually execute. Your logic can live on the private shard and then execute into public when it's ready.
Yeah, so that may already be there. We don't need to throw the ZK thing on. Sometimes it's just giving permissions. This is fantastic, and I would definitely keep my eyes on a lot of this technology. A lot of what we work on is really just the JavaScript tooling for dApp composability, and as we kind of we're spending most of our time in the EVM ecosystem just because that's where the tools are most known. But we're building these kind of action cards independent of how the implementation is going to be, what kind of calls it is, just JavaScript and ES modules coordinating in a asynchronous runtime in the browser. So I think I would love to be able to participate in the community and maybe try some of these things out in an ecosystem where the building blocks is already there, like this idea of like an action no-code tool strategy. We have the UI for it, but it's very hard to do in EVM, maybe easier to do with what we just mentioned today. We'd love to experiment with that.
Even more, you can package the business logic on smart contract and your front end into one thing, like old JavaScript, right? And have that. And so we actually have this already. We have some smart contracts that can serve front end. And so we have a standard for serving front end directly from smart contract. So you don't need to have like a separate server that says front end. You can actually have it all together. And so your cards can also be like pieces like that actually like expose the front end and actually plugs in directly.
Yeah, so the way we look at it is that we think of code in our current Web2 ecosystem as special, and then data is what sits on top of the deploy code. But that's not how the browsers work. The browsers thinks of code and data kind of fungibly, as long as you make a modules and you deploy it, and there's a module and you have a way of getting that in the HTTP in a loading module in the browser, you're good, right? People forget that the browser can just randomly load ZS module with some origin policy, and that's pretty good. And I think between that capability and what you just mentioned, I think we have a much more flexible thing where we don't need to necessarily have excuse me for using an analogy, like a priesthood of smart contract developer that can only make changes to the rules of the game and actually make users more of the kind of, what if I do this in my community or DAO? I think breaking that barrier, the developer is a gatekeeper for logic, is so important because it allows you to evolve these use cases much faster, because the people who evolve the use cases are much likely the users, community builder, much closer to what they want to do versus having to translate it in this somewhat big ceremony, especially with audits, which I think is helpful for where we have been, but it's actually a limiting factor for the use case I think we've discussed today.
For sure, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for walking us through all these things. I'm enlightened by it. I'm excited about the ecosystem, and as a JavaScript will never die person, and everything that can be built in JavaScript will be built in JavaScript at Whitlaw. I'm with you and your team on this journey and to embrace the possibility of JavaScript as a equalizer, as it always been. Is the most equalizing programming language of all time, and it is really fantastic to see that grow within anything. So thanks very much for your time, and we do this podcast to bring builders together to have that discussion, and I thank you for sharing your insights.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me. Had a great conversation.
Thank you. And as always, we do this premiere every Wednesday morning, 9:00 Eastern time, on YouTube Premiere and then distribute to all the podcast platform. If you're interested in this type of content, please subscribe. And otherwise, until next time, take care.